Hello, dear colleagues. I'm so happy to see all of you here at our channel. It's me. Today, we are going to talk about a very famous person. His name is Charles Robert Darwin, and he was born in England in 1809. When he was 3 years old, his sister died. It was a terrible tragedy. So he grew up with a feeling of loneliness. He didn't like sharing his toys or his food with other children. He had no friends. But when he was 12, he went to a boarding school, and there he made many friends. And now I want to tell you the names of these people because they were also important in the future. The headmaster of this school was a priest, John Henslow. Then there was another teacher, John Edmund Custis. And there was a boy in that class whose father was an apothecary. That means he sold medicine and helped sick people. This boy became a friend of Charles Darwin and helped him to learn a lot about nature. In the evenings, they collected insects and plants and studied them together. It seems that from the early years of his life, Charles Darwin was interested in everything connected with nature. Once his father gave him a book about animals, and he enjoyed reading it very much. He drew pictures of the birds which he saw in the countryside. And then one day he found a beetle. This one right here. He put it on the windowsill and just looked at it. And since that day, he became interested in beetles. And not only in beetles, but in all living things. He started to collect beetles and preserved them, dried them. And then he began studying their anatomy. And believe me, colleagues, he learned a lot. He studied how these creatures move, how they breathe, how they eat. And, most importantly, he realized that if we observe them all the time, we can learn a lot about nature and understand how living things appeared on Earth. As you know, in those days, people thought that every kind of plant and animal was created separately for its own purpose. For example, people said that a fish was created for eating by humans. Birds were created for singing, and bees were created for making honey. However, Charles Darwin didn't agree with these ideas. He couldn't understand why an armadillo would need a shell. What does it protect it from? He couldn't understand what the function of the long neck of a giraffe was, and why a chameleon could change color. And above all, he couldn't understand why so many species of animals and plants exist on Earth. And he started looking for answers to these questions. When Charles Darwin was 16 years old, his father sent him to university to study to become a doctor. But it didn't work out. He didn't enjoy being a doctor at all. At the same time, he really liked natural sciences. He liked geology and chemistry. So he finished the course of natural sciences and got a degree in this field. After graduating from university, he became a priest like his father. You may be surprised, but in those days, many priests were also interested in science. Maybe you remember Gregor Mendel, the man who discovered the laws of genetics. Well, he was also a priest. But let's go back to Charles Darwin. At first, he wanted to travel around the world and write books about his adventures. But then he received an invitation to join a scientific expedition to South America, and Charles Darwin chose science. It became one of the best decisions in his life. And now let's look at the ship on which Charles Darwin traveled to South America. This ship was called the Beagle. He wasn't the leader of the expedition, so he had to do a lot of odd jobs. Sometimes he had to clean the toilets. Sometimes he had to cook food. But he didn't mind doing all this, because he had time to collect plants, insects, minerals, and rocks. During his travels, he visited many countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, among others. And in all of these places, he studied the nature around him. He observed plants and animals. He asked local residents if they had seen some rare animals or plants. And even when the ship was sailing, he kept working and drawing birds which he saw on the islands. Once the ship arrived at the Galapagos Islands. These islands are located near the equator. They belong to Ecuador, but they are 100 kilometers away from the mainland. The climate on these islands is mild. There are no snakes, rats, cats, or dogs. And because of this, many animals live on these islands that can't be found anywhere else. Here you can see a marine iguana. It can be found only in these islands. Or take a listen to the song of a mockingbird. This bird lives only in the Galapagos Islands. Take a look at the Galapagos tortoise. These tortoises can live up to 100 years. And all these animals got used to humans and aren't afraid of us. And Charles Darwin spent 5 weeks on these islands, and he noticed that all the mockingbirds sang in the same way. No one taught them. They just all sang the same song. So he decided to catch a few birds and take them to England. But the captain of the ship didn't allow him to do it. The captain was afraid that the birds would die during the voyage. So Darwin took photos of the birds instead. And later, when he returned home, he began to study the photos and noticed that each island had its own kind of mockingbird. Yes, they all looked alike, but their beaks were different. On one island, they were short and thick. On the second island, they were thin and long. And on the third island, they were big and curved. So he concluded that all these birds descended from one common ancestor, but they changed over time. Well, that's where our story about his travels ends. Of course, he brought a lot of plants and animals from South America, but not enough for scientists to pay attention to them. In addition, when he returned home, he got very ill with a high fever and spent almost 2 years recovering. It seemed that nothing good would come out of this trip, but a few years later, Charles Darwin published his book and explained his theory to the world. Now, I want to tell you that the word theory doesn't mean something you guess or assume. No, it means the result of many observations, experiments, and conclusions. Charles Darwin worked on his theory for 20 years, and when he finally published his book, he was already married. In 1839, he married Emma Wedgwood. She was the daughter of a wealthy family. Her family was against the idea of marrying a scientist. First, they didn't have any money. Second, they believed that scientists were atheists. But still, she married Charles Darwin. They had 10 children, but only 3 of them survived. You can imagine how difficult it was for Charles Darwin to support his family with a scientist's salary. That's why he had to work a lot. He taught classes at university and wrote books. In 1858, he met an old friend from childhood, Alfred Russel Wallace. Once they met and started talking about their research, it turned out that Wallace came to the same conclusion as Darwin. He also thought that animals and plants change over time. Of course, he also had evidence for this. He collected a lot of facts while traveling through Asia. So Darwin and Wallace decided to publish their theories at the same time, so that no one could say that one of them stole the idea from the other. And that's exactly what happened. Both books were published. One of them was called On the Origin of Species, and the second was called The Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. Darwin's book was much more interesting to read, so it was quickly bought up. Darwin became famous, but not everyone agreed with his theory. Now I want to tell you that this theory was revolutionary. Before Darwin, people thought that God created every kind of plant and animal, and that all species are immutable. However, Darwin claimed that all species on Earth descended from common ancestors and constantly change. People couldn't accept this idea, and they were right to do so. They couldn't accept this idea because Darwin did not have any evidence for his theory. All he had was his observations and thoughts. He couldn't prove his theory, but he inspired people to look for proof. Here's a funny fact. A few years after publishing his theory, Darwin met a woman. He wanted to talk to her, but he was too shy, and he asked Wallace to introduce him. But when Wallace introduced them, he said, "Mr. Darwin, this is Missy Ass. She's descended from a long line of English divines." And Darwin replied, "Don't tell me we're related." But anyway, people started searching for evidence to prove Darwin's theory, and they found it. For example, in 1972, a paleontologist discovered the remains of Archaeopteryx. This creature lived 145 million years ago, and until that moment, scientists thought that birds descended from reptiles. But the remains of Archaeopteryx showed that birds are actually dinosaurs. That means Darwin was right. Then, in 1987, scientists found fossils of a creature that lived 550 million years ago. It was an invertebrate. Invertebrates are animals without backbones, like jellyfish, worms, insects, and so on. Scientists thought that invertebrates evolved slowly and gradually. However, it turned out that this creature was completely different from modern invertebrates. It had a skeleton. That means evolution happened quickly. And once again, Darwin was right. And today, many scientists continue to study the history of life on Earth and continue to prove Darwin's theory. By the way, this year, 2023, will be the 200th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's theory. That means this year we will have a lot of interesting discoveries. And now, I want to share one secret with you. Actually, Charles Darwin never invented his theory. It was given to him. It was given to him by his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. He was a physician and an amateur scientist, and in his book, he described his theory of evolution. Charles Darwin read this book and believed that nature must be reasonable and logical. That's why he devoted his whole life to proving his grandfather's theory. And now, let's talk about what would happen if Charles Darwin never existed. It's clear that his theory is correct. We have many proofs for this today. But if he never existed, we would have continued to think that all species are immutable. We wouldn't know how to explain the diversity of living beings. And maybe we wouldn't have been able to develop genetic engineering. But you shouldn't think that it was easy for Charles Darwin to dedicate his life to science. He had a lot of problems in his life. He suffered from seasickness and often felt bad during his travels. He had many children, and it was difficult for him to support his family. And besides, he was very worried that people wouldn't accept his theory. But despite all the difficulties, Charles Darwin made a huge contribution to the development of science. And for that, we should be grateful to him. And now, I want to tell you a little more about his personality. Charles Darwin was a very modest person. He always said that all his discoveries were made by accident. He also said that he wasn't talented, just diligent. He was a very friendly person and answered all the letters he received. He corresponded with many famous people, including Thomas Huxley and Alfred Russel Wallace, and Charles Darwin was also a very honest person. Once a butterfly flew into his room, and he carefully caught it and released it outside. And when he went for a walk, he never stepped on a beetle or a worm. He simply bypassed them. So, let's sum up the results. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and died in 1882. That's 173 years ago. Do you think that people have forgotten about him? No, of course not. If you go to England, you can visit Darwin's House Museum. You can see his personal belongings and his library. It stands in the town of Down, where Darwin lived for 40 years. And you can also watch a movie about him. The Theory of Everything tells the story of Stephen Hawking and his wife. But the beginning of the film shows how Charles Darwin developed his theory. Well, colleagues, I told you a lot of facts about Charles Darwin today. But there are still many interesting stories and discoveries that I didn't mention. Unfortunately, we don't have time to tell all of this in one lesson. Maybe I'll do it in the next videos. So if you are interested, please subscribe to our channel. And if you have something to add, leave a comment under this video. I'll be grateful for any comments.